She thought she was in control. She thought her authority was absolute. But when a flight attendant crossed the wrong family mid-flight, she had no idea that the man she was dismissing so easily was not just another passenger, but the owner of the entire airline. What started as a routine flight quickly spiraled into disaster, and before the plane even touched down, her career, reputation, and future had already crashed. She had spent years deciding who belonged in first class. Now she was the one being removed, and by the time she realized the weight of her mistake, it was far too late. Before we dive into this shocking story, comment below where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like these, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another jaw-dropping tale of power, karma, and consequences. Emily had worked for Imperial Skies Airlines for over a decade, and in all those years, she had perfected the art of control. Control over passengers, control over her fellow flight attendants, and most importantly, control over the first-class experience. She wasn't just a senior flight attendant, she was a gatekeeper, ensuring that only the right kind of passengers truly belonged in first class. It was her kingdom, and she ruled it with an iron fist wrapped in a silk glove. To her, first class wasn't just about luxury. It was about exclusivity, an unspoken agreement that those who occupied its pristine leather seats were of a certain status, a certain demeanor, and most importantly, a certain level of quiet refinement. She loathed disturbances, resented unnecessary noise, and despised passengers who didn't fit the aesthetic she envisioned for her domain. That morning, as she adjusted the perfectly folded napkins on the serving tray and did a final sweep of the first-class cabin, she felt confident that this flight would be as smooth and controlled as ever. The passengers in first class were the usual type: business executives buried in their tablets, a well-dressed elderly couple murmuring in hushed tones, and a young man in a designer suit, staring out the window with a bored expression. Everything was in order, or so she thought. Just as she was about to retreat to the galley, the boarding doors closed with a soft hiss, and her eyes landed on an immediate problem: a woman carrying a small child stepping into first class. At first glance, Arya looked composed, but to Emily, she was a disruption before she even sat down. The little boy in her arms, barely 2 years old, shifted uncomfortably, his big brown eyes blinking sleepily as he whined softly. Emily felt her jaw tighten. Children didn't belong in first class. Not in her world, anyway. She had seen enough elite passengers give disapproving glances at young children who disrupted their peaceful flights, and she had, on occasion, used subtle tactics to ensure families with kids felt unwelcome. This was supposed to be a flawless, undisturbed flight, but now she had to deal with this. Before we get deeper into the story, take a moment to subscribe and follow our channel for more gripping, dramatic tales that keep you on the edge of your seat. Emily took a controlled breath and moved down the aisle with her perfected customer service smile, the kind that looked polite but held no real warmth. "Ma'am," she said, her voice a practiced level of firm but professional, "this is first class." The words were loaded, dripping with implication. Arya looked up, her expression unbothered. "I know," she replied, shifting her son in her lap as she settled into the plush seat. She reached into her purse, pulling out a first-class boarding pass and placing it on the armrest, as if anticipating the challenge. Emily hesitated, her fingers twitching at her sides. She hadn't expected that. Her mind scrambled for another approach. "Right," she said smoothly, scanning the ticket as though she doubted its authenticity, even though she knew better. "I just wanted to make sure you're aware that first class maintains a certain atmosphere. Other passengers expect a peaceful flight." Her gaze flickered down to the child, who was still shifting in his mother's arms but was far from the screaming tantrum thrower she had braced herself for. He was just restless, a normal child on a long flight. But Emily didn't care. She wanted him gone. "Of course," Arya said, offering a polite but clipped smile. "We'll do our best." She turned her attention back to her son. gently rubbing his back as he nestled against her shoulder, completely oblivious to the silent battle unfolding between his mother and the flight attendant. Emily lingered for a moment, waiting, hoping for a reason to escalate the situation further. She hated that Arya wasn't rattled. Most passengers would have already started making excuses or apologizing. Instead, this woman acted as if she belonged here. Emily despised that. Finally, with no legitimate reason to press further, she forced a tight nod and turned on her heel, retreating to the galley. But as she did, she threw one final glance over her shoulder, her mind already calculating how to make this flight as unpleasant as possible for the mother and her child. She just needed one reason, one slip-up, and she was patient. She could wait. Emily stood in the galley, gripping the edges of the beverage cart with white-knuckled intensity, her irritation simmering beneath her perfectly composed exterior. She hated disruptions, and more than that, she hated the feeling of losing control over her cabin. The presence of a restless toddler in first class had already shattered her carefully maintained order, and now each soft whimper from the child grated against her nerves like nails on a chalkboard. She had dealt with children before. Spoiled ones from elite families who were indulged beyond reason, but at least their wealthy parents knew how to keep them in check. This, however, was different. Arya did not carry the air of someone who truly belonged in first class. Her presence wasn't loud or out of place in an obvious way, but it was something Emily could sense. An invisible line that had been crossed, the way she carried herself with quiet confidence, the way she didn't shrink under scrutiny. Emily hated it. She had spent years crafting an image of who belonged up here, and this mother and child did not fit that mold. As she busied herself with busy work, needlessly adjusting trays and refilling napkins, her sharp eyes kept darting back to seat 3A where Arya sat, gently rocking her son as he shifted uncomfortably in her lap. Cyrus wasn't screaming. He wasn't throwing a tantrum. He wasn't disturbing the flight in any real way. And yet, Emily felt a compulsion to reinforce her authority. She turned to her junior flight attendant, Nicolette, a fresh-faced recruit who was still adjusting to the hierarchy of the cabin crew. "I'm going to do another round of passenger check-ins," Emily announced. Though it was unnecessary, she had already made the rounds twice. Nicolette nodded, clearly too intimidated to question her senior. Straightening her blazer and plastering on her best artificial smile, Emily made her way down the aisle with slow, measured steps, her polished heels clicking against the floor. She paused beside Arya's seat, ensuring that her presence was looming. "Ma'am," she said, keeping her voice sweet but firm, "I need to remind you that first class is meant to be a calm environment. I'm sure you understand that our passengers expect a certain level of comfort." She let the sentence hang, the implication clear. Arya looked up from her son, her expression unreadable. "Of course," she replied evenly, gently adjusting the blanket wrapped around Cyrus. "He's just tired. I'm sure he'll be asleep soon." Emily didn't believe that for a second. She folded her arms across her chest, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make the mother uncomfortable. "I understand traveling with young children can be difficult," she added, her voice laced with patronizing sympathy. "But if the noise continues, I may have to ask you to help keep the environment in mind." The microaggression was deliberate. She wasn't asking, she was warning. Before we get deeper into this intense moment, make sure to subscribe and follow our channel for more gripping real-life stories that will leave you speechless. Arya's grip on Cyrus tightened slightly, but her face remained calm, her composure infuriatingly steady. "I appreciate the concern," she said, her voice like smooth glass, controlled, unshaken. "But I assure you I'm doing everything I can. He's not screaming, he's not disturbing anyone, and he's certainly not causing a scene." Her gaze flickered just briefly toward the other passengers, many of whom had now turned their attention back to their screens or newspapers, pretending not to listen. Arya had made her point without needing to say it outright. The only one making this an issue was Emily. Emily felt her stomach twist, her irritation deepening into something sharper, more personal. She had expected this woman to flinch, to apologize, to acknowledge that she was stepping out of line, but she hadn't. Instead, Arya had done something far worse. She had challenged her without outright defiance. Emily straightened, smoothing down the front of her uniform. "As long as we're on the same page," she said with a tight smile, but there was no warmth behind it. She turned on her heel and walked away, but the interaction left a bitter taste in her mouth. As she reached the galley again, she exhaled sharply, frustrated that she had not come out on top. She could still feel Arya's unbothered gaze in her mind, a quiet defiance that made Emily's teeth clench. Fine. If the woman wanted to act like she was untouchable, Emily would find a way to remind her exactly who was in charge here. She just needed an opportunity, and she would make sure she got one. Emily paced in the galley, her perfectly curated composure beginning to crack, though she kept her expression neutral. That woman, Arya, was acting as if she belonged here, as if she had every right to be in first class without so much as a second glance. And Emily hated it. More than that, she hated how Arya hadn't backed down, hadn't cowered, hadn't apologized for daring to bring her restless child into this space of quiet and refinement. It was arrogance, Emily told herself, the kind that came from people who thought rules didn't apply to them. The child, Cyrus, was still shifting in his mother's arms, not loud, not unruly, just slightly fussy, the way all young children were when confined to a plane for hours. But Emily wasn't interested in excuses. To her, first class was sacred, and that meant absolute peace. No disruptions, no special treatment, and no room for error. She took a breath, smoothing the fabric of her crisp navy uniform before stepping back into the aisle, scanning the passengers. Most were avoiding her gaze, some still engaged in their own business. But she knew they had witnessed her earlier interaction with Arya. Some had even looked uncomfortable. Not because of the child, but because of her. Emily's grip on her tray tightened. They didn't understand. They didn't see what she saw. An unchecked disruption, a broken pattern, an invasion into the exclusivity that first class was meant to uphold. She wouldn't let it stand. She couldn't. As she moved towards seat 3A, the slight murmuring of passengers and the ever-present hum of the engines filled the cabin. A white noise that barely masked her frustration. Then it happened. A small, seemingly insignificant movement. Cyrus shifted in his sleep, his tiny foot brushing against the hem of Emily's skirt. It was barely a touch, an unconscious, innocent gesture. But for Emily, it was the final straw. Without thinking, without hesitating, she reached down and slapped the child's wrist. It wasn't hard, it wasn't a blow, but it was deliberate, sharp, and unforgivable. The soft smack echoed in the unnatural silence that followed, a sound so out of place, so shocking, that time seemed to stop. For a second, nobody moved, nobody breathed. Arya froze, her eyes widening in pure, unfiltered shock, as she instinctively pulled her son closer, her arms wrapping around him protectively. Cyrus, startled, let out a sharp, pained whimper, not from the force of the slap, but from the sheer fear of it. His little fingers clung to his mother's blouse as he buried his face in her shoulder, trembling. And then came the worst part, the weight of silence. It was suffocating. It was paralyzing. Every nearby passenger had turned toward them, eyes wide, expressions caught between disbelief and horror. Even the ones who had previously ignored Emily's growing hostility couldn't pretend anymore. What had just happened was not normal. It was not okay. But Emily didn't register the enormity of her mistake, not at first. She straightened, smoothing her uniform as if she had just fixed a minor inconvenience. "Teach your child some discipline," she muttered under her breath, her tone clipped and disapproving, as if she hadn't just done something that would change the course of her entire life. Arya's breathing had slowed, too slow, too measured. The kind of breath people took when they were on the edge of breaking. Her grip on her son was firm, but her body was rigid. When she finally looked up, her expression was unreadable. But her eyes burned with something dangerous. And that was when Emily felt it. A shift in the air, a change in the atmosphere, the growing realization that she had gone too far. But before she could even begin to process the weight of what she had just done, a voice sliced through the tension like a knife. A voice so calm, so steady, so dangerously composed that it sent chills down her spine. What did you just do? It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it carried weight. A weight that demanded immediate answers. Emily's head snapped toward the source, and that was when she saw him. A man in the first row of business class, tall, composed, utterly unreadable. His gaze was locked onto her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. At first, she didn't recognize him. He looked like just another well-dressed businessman. Dark tailored suit, a sleek silver watch gleaming under the cabin lights. But there was something in the way he sat, the way he held himself, the absolute control in his expression that made Emily's stomach twist. Passengers turned toward him. Some exchanged knowing glances, others whispered, and then, just loud enough for Emily to hear, someone muttered something that made her breath hitch in her throat. "That's Zayden Grayson. He owns this airline." The realization hit her like a plane slamming into turbulence. Her pulse skyrocketed. Her breath caught in her throat. And for the first time in her entire career, Emily felt fear. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and follow our channel for more shocking, jaw-dropping stories like this one. She opened her mouth, scrambling to respond, to control the situation before it spiraled further, but no words came out. Because what could she possibly say? She had just put her hands on the son of the most powerful man in the airline industry, and everyone had seen it. The passengers, the other flight attendants, the security cameras. There was no way out of this. No excuse that could undo what had just happened. Zayden hadn't moved yet, but that made it worse. He didn't need to. He was just watching and studying her, waiting. And Emily knew without a doubt that this was the moment her life changed. But she had no idea just how much she was about to lose. The weight of silence was suffocating, stretching across the cabin like a taut wire, ready to snap at any moment. Emily's heartbeat pounded in her ears as she stared at the man who had spoken, the words still hanging in the air like a sentence she hadn't yet processed. "What did you just do?" It wasn't shouted, wasn't barked in anger, but the quiet intensity behind it was infinitely worse. It was the kind of voice that didn't need volume to command attention, the kind that could halt an entire room with nothing but a whisper. Passengers turned toward the source of the voice, eyes widening in recognition. A low murmur rippled through the cabin, hushed voices whispering like a rising tide. And then it happened. A single name was spoken, barely audible, but powerful enough to change the course of the entire situation. "That's Zayden Grayson." The words hit Emily like a shockwave, her stomach plummeting so fast she thought she might actually faint. For a second, she swore she misheard. Number? It couldn't be. It couldn't be him. But then she saw the way the other passengers reacted. The subtle shifts in posture, the way eyes darted toward him and then quickly away, like they were afraid to stare too long. A businessman in first class adjusted his cufflinks nervously. A flight attendant near the galley stiffened but said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line. The recognition spread like wildfire, setting off a chain reaction of silent panic. And suddenly, Emily realized exactly who she had crossed. Zayden Grayson, Chief Executive Officer of Imperial Skies Airlines, the owner of the airline, the man who, with a single phone call, could end her entire career before the plane even touched the ground. She felt her throat tighten, her breath catching as if she had just stepped into quicksand. This wasn't just some wealthy businessman. This wasn't an elite passenger who could be smoothed over with fake apologies and forced politeness. This was the top of the food chain. The man who signed the checks, the one who didn't take insults. He erased them, and she had just slapped his son. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe and follow our channel for more shocking, jaw-dropping stories like this one. You won't want to miss what happens next. Emily's breath came shallow, her mind racing for a way out, for something, anything she could say to salvage the situation. "Sir," she started, her voice tight, professional, grasping desperately for control. "I assure you there was no harm intended. The child was—" "A child!" Zayden cut her off, his voice still eerily calm, but there was something underneath it now. Something controlled. Dangerous. Emily swallowed hard. This was the part where she was supposed to take control of the narrative. This was where she should have been able to gaslight, manipulate, or redirect the situation before it escalated. But she couldn't, because Zayden wasn't just another passenger, and he wasn't playing by her rules. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the armrests, his expression unreadable. "I want to make sure I understand this correctly," he said, his tone deceptively smooth. "You put your hands on my son, and now you want to explain why." The question landed like a grenade. Passengers sucked in quiet breaths, watching as the moment unfolded like something out of a courtroom drama. Even the flight attendants, Emily's own colleagues, were keeping their distance, unwilling to get involved. Because they already knew. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't an incident that could be swept under the rug with the right words. This was something far worse. Emily opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Her throat was dry, her pulse hammering against her skin like a ticking clock. The realization sank in like ice water down her spine. She had spent years enforcing control over passengers, believing she held the power in these situations. But now, for the first time, she was the one being judged. And the worst part? She had no defense. Arya, who had been silent this whole time, finally lifted her chin, her expression steady but burning. "You don't get to put your hands on my child," she said, her voice quiet but filled with steel. Emily felt something shift even further. This wasn't just about the slap anymore. It wasn't even about Cyrus. It was about power. It was about the fact that Emily had seen Arya and her son as people she could control. And now the roles were reversing. Emily forced herself to breathe, forced herself to find a way out. "Sir, she started, but the words felt hollow, useless. There is no way out of this, and Zayden knew it. He finally stood, his movements slow, deliberate. The air seemed to constrict around them, the tension thick enough to drown in. "Get me the captain," he said. The finality in those words was terrifying. Emily's entire world tilted on its axis. The whispers in the cabin grew louder, passengers watching with a mixture of fascination and horror. One of the junior flight attendants, Nicolette, hesitated for only a second before hurrying toward the cockpit. This was it. This was the moment Emily Whitmore's entire life began to crumble. Emily's world had suddenly shrunk to the size of the first-class cabin, her carefully crafted authority dissolving in front of her eyes, yet her instincts refused to let her submit. She wasn't powerless, not yet. She had handled difficult passengers before, diffused tense situations, and turned complaints into misunderstandings with the right mix of manipulation and condescension. But this was different. This time she had no leverage, no control, no escape, and it was sinking in fast. As Nicolette disappeared into the cockpit to summon the captain, Emily's pulse pounded, her mind racing through possible exit strategies. Deny everything, minimize the situation, shift the blame. These had worked in the past, so why do they feel useless now? Because they were. Because this wasn't just any passenger she had crossed. This wasn't an entitled businessman who could be soothed with a free drink or an upgrade. This was Zayden Grayson. And he wasn't angry. He wasn't yelling. He was watching her, his gaze a calm, controlled force that felt more dangerous than any explosion of fury could have been. That was what terrified her the most. She had seen passengers yell before. She had even had people demand her firing over minor slights. None of that scared her. But Zayden? Zayden was composed, And that meant he was already thinking, already deciding her fate. The weight of it pressed against her chest, suffocating. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and follow our channel for more jaw-dropping real-life stories that will leave you speechless. She forced a breath into her lungs, swallowing the growing panic in her throat. She had to act. Now, the longer she stood there, frozen in place like a rookie on her first flight, the more power she surrendered. She needed to take control back, even if it was only an illusion. Straightening her posture, she turned towards Zayden, adopting her most professional tone. "Sir, I understand that emotions are high right now," she said, forcing a calm smile as if she were addressing a passenger who had simply been assigned the wrong meal. "I want to assure you that I meant no harm. It was a misunderstanding. I was merely trying to—" A misunderstanding. The way Zayden repeated the word, slow and deliberate, made the blood drain from Emily's face. He tilted his head slightly as if he were studying a rare species of incompetence. "You put your hands on my son." His voice never rose, but somehow it felt like the entire plane had gotten quieter. Every pair of eyes in first class was now locked onto them, waiting for what would happen next. Emily's palms felt clammy. Her usual tactics weren't working. She needed something stronger, authority. If she could redirect the power dynamic, remind him, that she was the senior flight attendant on this aircraft, maybe, just maybe, she could tilt this back in her favor. "Sir," she said, pressing her hands together, her voice lower, soothing, the same tone she had used to calm difficult passengers in the past. "While I understand your concern, I have to remind you that I am responsible for maintaining order in this cabin. First-class passengers expect a certain standard of comfort, and—" Zayden let out a short breath, not quite a laugh, but something close. A sound that said, "Are you really doing this?" "You think this is about comfort?" he asked, his voice still unwavering, still in control. Emily hesitated. This was slipping from her. The power, the authority, the very foundation of how she operated. It was disappearing. She had to fix this. "Now, I think," she said carefully, steeling herself, "that you might be overreacting to—" "Overreacting?" That time his voice dropped a degree lower, a shift so subtle and yet so devastating that Emily's throat closed up. He wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. The entire cabin had gone dead silent. Passengers had stopped pretending to mind their business, their gazes flicking between Emily and Zayden like they were watching a courtroom verdict unfold in real time. Even the other flight attendants had gone still, their loyalties unclear, but their unease obvious. Zayden finally moved, shifting slightly in his seat, his expression giving away nothing. "Tell me, Emily," he said smoothly. She stiffened. How did he? Of course, he knew her name. She was on duty. Her name tag. But somehow hearing it from his lips felt worse, more ominous. "If I had been just another passenger," he continued, his voice calm, surgical, "if I wasn't the person signing your paychecks, then would you still be standing here trying to justify what you did?" Her breath caught. She knew the answer, and so did everyone else. She had never felt this exposed before. She had spent her entire career knowing how to handle people, knowing exactly what to say, what tone to us, what lines to never cross. But now she was the one backed into a corner, and she hated it. The cockpit door swung open, and Captain Reed stepped out, his expression unreadable, but he wasn't alone. A second man, dressed in a crisp corporate suit, thus followed behind him. And that was when Emily knew she had made the biggest mistake of her life. The second the cockpit door swung open, the entire dynamic of the cabin shifted, as if the air itself had thickened. Captain Reed stepped out first, his expression unreadable, but it was the man behind him that made Emily's stomach drop like a free-falling plane. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a dark gray suit, with the kind of polished authority that only belonged to corporate executives. Emily had been with Imperial Skies Airlines long enough to recognize a problem when she saw one. And this was a catastrophe. She had assumed she was handling a minor dispute, a conflict that could be de-escalated, twisted in her favor with the right amount of gaslighting and corporate jargon. But she had been wrong. So very, very wrong. Her entire body tensed as Zayden Grayson remained perfectly still in his seat, arms resting on the armrest, his posture deceptively relaxed. But the power he exuded was suffocating. He wasn't just watching anymore, he was waiting. Waiting for her to realize exactly how bad of a mistake she had made. And then it hit her. This isn't a misunderstanding. This isn't a bad interaction. This is my career on the line. The realization was like ice water down her spine, freezing her in place as the executive adjusted his cuffs and finally spoke. "Miss Emily Whitmore," he said, his voice so smooth, so professional it was almost cruel. He already knew her name. Of course he does. Of course he does. Her breath hitched, her mind grasping for an escape route that didn't exist. "Sir," she started, forcing a tight, professional smile, the same one she had used countless times to de-escalate complaints, to talk her way out of disciplinary meetings. "I believe there's been a—" "Stop!" The single word came from Captain Reed, sharp, decisive, cutting off any pathetic attempt she was about to make at damage control. And suddenly Emily understood. There is no talking my way out of this. There is nothing I can say that will fix what I've done. But she still tried. "Captain," she said, her voice lower now, carefully measured, the way she always spoke when she was one misstep away from being reprimanded. "I didn't mean to escalate the situation. The child was restless, and I was merely trying to ensure the comfort of the—" Zayden exhaled, shaking his head, and for the first time his expression changed. He smiled. It was not a good smile. It was the kind of smile that said, "You really don't get it, do you?" The kind of smile that sent a chill through Emily's bones. And then he spoke. "You still think this is about comfort?" His voice was low even, almost amused. But it wasn't amusement. It was finality. A death sentence. Emily opened her mouth. To do what? She didn't even know anymore, among apologize, plead, make excuses. But before she could, the executive turned toward Captain Reed. "This is no longer a crew matter," he said. And that was when Emily felt true, unshakable fear. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and follow our channel for more shocking real-life stories that will leave you speechless. No longer a crew matter. The words clawed through her like a knife. She had spent years working in this industry. She knew what that meant. It meant the decision was already made. It meant this wasn't going to be handled by the flight crew or the internal supervisor or even HR. This was above her now. This was corporate. This was a level of power she had no control over. "Miss Whitmore," the executive continued, his expression unreadable, "you are hereby relieved of duty, effective immediately." The words landed like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. Emily took a step back, her entire body stiffening. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't how things worked. "I handle the complaints. I file the reports. I'm the one who makes the calls, not them." "Sir, She tried again, desperation creeping into her tone, but it was too late. Zayden stood up. It was slow, deliberate. And somehow the act of him simply rising from his seat felt more powerful than anything else in that moment. He turned, fully facing her now, and there was something in his eyes. Something patient, as if he was watching someone realize they had already lost. "Captain," Zayden said, addressing Reed now, as if Emily wasn't even standing there anymore. "I assume you have procedures in place for situations like this." Emily's entire body went cold. Captain Reed gave a firm nod. "Yes, sir." "Good," Zayden said, adjusting his blazer, his gaze never once flickering back to Emily. "Then I assume I don't need to waste any more time here." And just like that, he was done with her. That was it. Emily had been wiped out of his world in a single sentence. She had spent years believing she held power over the passengers, that she was the one who dictated what happened in first class, that she made the rules. But now, she was nothing. And the worst part, she knew it. The executive turned back to her, his expression flat, professional. "Security will be waiting for you upon landing," he informed her. "You will remain in the crew area for the duration of the flight. Do you understand?" Emily's mind spun. No, 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 this can't be happening. "Sir," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper now, "please just let me explain." "Miss Whitmore." The executive cut her off, his tone final. "This conversation is over." And for the first time in her life, Emily had nothing left to say. The finality in the executive's voice settled over Emily like a death sentence, suffocating, absolute. She had spent years believing she controlled the passengers, believing she wielded the authority in first class. But in just a matter of minutes, that illusion had crumbled into dust. The air inside the cabin felt too thick, pressing down on her shoulders like a crushing weight, making every breath a struggle. She had been stripped of her power, her status, and her career, and yet the plane was still in the air, still hours from landing. She was trapped. Every step, every moment until they landed would be an agonizing descent into humiliation. The sound of Captain Reed's voice barely registered in her ears as he called over one of the junior flight attendants, Nicolette, the one who had been watching the whole thing unfold with wide, uncertain eyes. "Escort her to the crew area," Captain Reed ordered, his voice devoid of emotion, treating Emily as if she were just another disruptive passenger who needed to be contained. Nicolette hesitated. Even she knew this was the end. Emily wanted to resist, wanted to fight back, but the weight of the situation had finally crashed down on her. There was nothing left to argue, no corporate jargon she could use to twist the truth in her favor. The passengers had seen everything. They had heard Zayden Grayson speak her name with a level of disdain that might as well have been a death sentence in the airline industry. Her entire body felt numb as Nicolette took a hesitant step toward her, but it wasn't just her colleague's uncertainty that sent another wave of humiliation through Emily's veins. It was the silence. A silence that wasn't normal on a flight, a silence that didn't belong in first class. No more hushed conversations, no more murmured exchanges about business deals or vacation plans. Nothing. Everyone was watching her. Some with quiet satisfaction, others with thinly veiled amusement. But the worst ones? The ones who just looked away. Those were the passengers who had seen people like her before, people who thought they had power, who thought they were untouchable, only to watch it slip away in an instant. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and follow our channel for more jaw-dropping, real-life stories that will leave you speechless. Emily forced herself to move, her feet heavy, unwilling, as she turned toward the narrow aisle that would lead her toward the crew seating area, toward the longest, most humiliating walk of her life. And then it happened. A sound that sent rage burning through her veins, the unmistakable, barely muffled click of a phone camera. Someone had taken a picture. Her eyes snapped to the source, but she didn't even know who it was because now there were multiple passengers subtly lowering their phones, pretending they hadn't just documented her downfall. A man in first class cleared his throat, shifting in his seat, but he wasn't even looking at her anymore. He was looking at Zayden, waiting for him to say something, but Zayden didn't. He didn't spare Emily another glance, didn't acknowledge her humiliation, didn't even react to the fact that she was still standing there, still unraveling. Because to him, she was already gone. That was the moment that broke her. Not being stripped of her title, not the threat of security waiting for her upon landing, not even the fact that she would never work in aviation again. It was this. The fact that the man who had just erased her career didn't even see her as a problem anymore. She was nothing to him. And yet, she still had to walk past him. Her legs trembled as she took a slow, shaky step forward, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. She could still feel their eyes on her, still hear the subtle whispers from the passengers who thought they were being quiet, the ones who were already spreading the story in real time. But she didn't dare lift her head, because if she did, she might have seen Arya watching her, and she couldn't take that. She had already lost everything. She wasn't about to lose her pride, too. But even as she reached the end of the first-class section, even as Nicolette opened the curtain to the crew area, Emily made one final mistake. She turned back, just for a second. Her gaze found Xaden. He wasn't looking at her. Of course he wasn't, but Arya? She was. And the look on her face? It wasn't smug. It wasn't triumphant. It was pity. Emily hated that look more than anything. She turned sharply, pushing past the curtain, finally disappearing from first class for the last time. And just like that, the walk of shame was over. But the worst was yet to come. Emily sat rigidly in the cramped crew seat, her breathing shallow, her pulse erratic, as the cabin hummed around her. She was no longer part of it, not the flight, not the airline, not the industry she had dedicated herself to for years. The door separating first class from the crew area had closed behind her, but it felt like a wall had been built between the person she was before this flight and the person she was now. She was alone, cut off, erased. The very thought sent a shudder through her body, her nails digging into her palms, but she forced herself to sit perfectly still, as if by remaining motionless she could stop the inevitable. Her mind raced, grasping for solutions, anything she could say, anything she could do. But all she could hear was the faint murmur of voices from behind the curtain, the passengers in first class already moving on, already forgetting her. But the one voice that mattered most, the only voice that could have saved her, remained silent. Xaden Grayson hadn't spoken her name again. He hadn't demanded further action, hadn't even bothered to confirm her punishment. Because he didn't need to, his silence was more damning than words could ever be. He had seen what she had done, had judged her, and with a single glance he had sentenced her to professional death. And the worst part? He had done it without a second thought. Emily's stomach twisted. For years, she had been the one who decided fates, who filed complaints, who made recommendations on who deserved a second chance and who didn't. She had thrived in control, but now she was the one being removed, the one being whispered about, the one whose name was turning into a cautionary tale. She swallowed hard, staring at the crew communication panel, the small screen glowing in the dim light. If she had any hope, any last attempt to salvage what remained of her career, it lay in the hands of the people in charge. The captain. The corporate executive who had walked out of the cockpit without hesitation, without looking back. They had made their decision already. She could hear Nicolette shifting uncomfortably nearby, the junior flight attendant who had been tasked with escorting her out of first class. The girl hadn't spoken a word since leading her back here, her posture tense, as if being near Emily might get her into trouble too. Emily would have laughed if she weren't on the verge of suffocating under the weight of her own mistakes. Smart girl? She kept her head down, eyes fixed on her hands, but her mind refused to be quiet. How did this happen? How did it all fall apart so fast? But deep down she already knew. It wasn't just the slap. It wasn't even the fact that it had been Xaden Grayson's son. It was everything before that. The microaggressions, the assumptions, the way she had looked at Arya and Cyrus the second they had stepped into first class and decided they didn't belong. And now, she was the one being cast out. The irony was suffocating. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and follow our channel for more jaw-dropping real-life stories that will leave you speechless. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, jolting her out of her spiraling thoughts. Ladies and gentlemen, we have begun our final descent. Flight attendants, prepare for landing. Emily barely registered the words. Landing. The moment when everything would become real. Because the second those wheels hit the tarmac, she would no longer be Emily Whitmore, senior flight attendant. She would just be Emily, a disgraced ex-employee, a cautionary tale, a woman who had thrown her career away with one mistake. Her fingers twitched toward her pocket where her crew ID badge still sat. It felt heavier now, its weight mocking her. Would they even let her keep it? Or would security take it the second she stepped off the plane? God, security would be waiting for her. That thought sent another wave of nausea rolling through her. It was one thing to be relieved of duty mid-flight. It was another thing entirely to be met at the gate like a criminal. Her mind flashed through the possibilities. Passengers watching as she was escorted through the terminal. Whispers spreading like wildfire, cameras flashing, someone leaking a video online. By tomorrow, her name could be everywhere, and Zayden Grayson wouldn't even have to say a word. His silence would destroy her. Emily's nails dug into her palm, her breathing shaky, but she forced herself to sit up straighter to keep her head high, even if it was just for show. She would not fall apart. Not yet. The final moments of the descent felt like a slow, agonizing countdown to the inevitable. Outside the small window near the galley, the city lights twinkled against the night sky, but Emily barely saw them. Her fate was no longer in her hands. She had spent her entire career believing she had power, that she could dictate what happened on her flights, who stayed, who left, who mattered. And now she was about to learn what it felt like to be the one thrown away. The landing gear engaged with a heavy thud, the tires skidding against the runway, and as the plane slowed, as the final stretch of the flight came to an end, Emily exhaled shakily, her stomach knotting tighter and tighter. Because the worst part wasn't the landing, the worst part was what came next. The moment when she would have to stand up, when she would have to face the reality of what she had done. And worst of all, the moment she would have to walk off this plane knowing she wasn't coming back. The moment the plane touched down, Emily felt the wheels screech against the tarmac, but the noise outside was nothing compared to the storm raging inside her chest. This was it. The final descent had ended, but her fall was far from over. She had spent years believing she owned the aisles of first class, believing that she controlled who belonged and who didn't. Now she was about to be escorted off the plane like a disgraced criminal, her authority shattered, her reputation in ruins. Every breath she took felt forced, as if the very air inside the aircraft had turned against her. The distant murmur of passengers unbuckling their seatbelts filled the cabin, the same casual routine that happened at the end of every flight. But this time, Emily wasn't part of it. She was no longer a flight attendant preparing to ensure a smooth disembarkation. She was an exile waiting to be discarded. The seatbelt sign dinged off and immediately passengers moved. The air shifted. Emily could hear whispers, hushed murmurs, glances stolen in her direction. They weren't talking about the flight. They weren't talking about the weather. They were talking about her. About the flight attendant who had crossed the wrong man. She clenched her hands into fists, trying to maintain some semblance of control, but the panic was clawing at her throat. She had no control anymore. No authority. No way to dictate what happened next. The cabin crew was already avoiding her gaze, even the ones who had worked under her. The ones who used to listen when she barked orders. Now, they were pretending they didn't see her. Pretending she didn't exist. Because in the eyes of Imperial Skies Airlines, she didn't. Not anymore. A movement at the front of the plane caught her eye and her stomach plummeted. Security! 2 men in dark uniforms had stepped onto the jet bridge, their presence sending a silent but deafening message through the cabin. They weren't looking for a criminal, they were here for her. The humiliation burned through her veins. She had escorted unruly passengers off flights before. She had watched as the security dragged out those who didn't follow the rules. But now it was her. She was the one who was being removed. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and follow our channel for more jaw-dropping real-life stories that will leave you speechless. Passengers started filing out. The first-class section emptied in an uncomfortable silence. No one lingered. No one looked at her too long. But she could still feel their eyes, still feel the weight of their judgment. She caught sight of a man discreetly tilting his phone, snapping a photo. Someone else whispered something to their seatmate, shaking their head. They're documenting this. They're going to talk about this for weeks. She swallowed hard, but her throat was dry, scratchy, suffocating. The aisle was clearing, but one row remained occupied. And when she saw who was still seated, her breath caught. Xaden, he was still there. Still sitting calmly. As if he had all the time in the world. As if her downfall was nothing more than an inconvenience, an afterthought. Arya sat beside him, holding Cyrus close, her expression unreadable, but it was the child's tiny, sleepy face that sent the final dagger into Emily's chest. He had already moved on. He wasn't crying. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't even aware of the career-ending chaos his presence had just caused. To him, Emily was nothing. And to Xaden, I was nothing too. The thought made her stomach churn. Why won't he leave? Why won't he go? He had already won. He had destroyed her with a single sentence, with a single decision. But he was still here, still watching, and it wasn't because he wanted to see her squirm. It was because he didn't care enough to rush. She forced herself to breathe, forced herself to stand, but her legs felt like they didn't belong to her. This was it, her final walk. The moment. She would be escorted past the very passengers she used to command. The moment her career officially ended. Captain Reed stepped forward, his voice low, formal. "Miss Whitmore, you'll exit last." "Of course, I'm being handled like an incident, like an emergency." She nodded stiffly. She had no choice. Passengers streamed out one by one, passing by Xaden as if he were a king overseeing a departure from his court. No one dared to acknowledge him. They knew better. They knew this was his plane, his airline, his world. And Emily had trespassed. The plane emptied. The security guards didn't move. They were waiting for her. Waiting for the signal. And then, at last, Xaden stood. Emily's breath locked in her throat. He adjusted his blazer, his movements slow, composed, deadly. He wasn't looking at her. He never looked at her. He turned to Captain Reed. "Make sure she's handled appropriately." Handled. Like I'm a problem that needs to be erased. Then, with no further words, no glance in her direction, Xaden took Arya's hand and stepped off the plane. And just like that, he was gone. The security guards finally moved. One gestured toward the exit. It was time. Emily felt her legs lock. She didn't want to do this. Didn't want to face the walk of shame through the terminal, the stares, the whispers, the photos that would be taken. But she had no choice. She straightened her spine, forcing her face into a mask of indifference, as if she still had an ounce of control. She didn't. And with the finality of a woman walking toward her own execution, she stepped forward and left the plane for the last time. The moment Emily Whitmore stepped off the plane, the sterile, artificial brightness of the airport terminal hit her like a spotlight in an interrogation room. She had walked through these halls 1,000 times before, head held high, uniform pristine, exuding the quiet confidence of someone who believed they were untouchable. But tonight, she wasn't walking as a respected senior flight attendant. She was walking as a ghost, someone who no longer belonged, someone whose very presence was a stain on the reputation of Imperial Sky's airlines. She barely registered the movement around her, the steady flow of passengers collecting their bags, the weary travelers making their way to their next connection, the flight crews moving with effortless precision toward their next assignments. The world was continuing on without her, and for the first time she realized it always would. She wasn't important. She never had been. The two security guards flanked her like silent executioners, their presence sending a clear message to anyone who might have wondered why a flight attendant was being escorted through the terminal instead of walking freely among her peers. She could already hear the whispers. She could feel the eyes following her. Some passengers had recognized her from the flight. Others had heard the rumors spreading through the airport like wildfire. And then there were the ones who didn't know her at all but could sense the weight of the moment, could tell by the stiff set of her shoulders and the quiet authority of the men beside her that something had happened, and that she was at the center of it. She kept her head up, refusing to let them see her break, but the humiliation burned inside her like acid. For years, she had walked these terminals with pride, had passed through security checkpoints with a sense of purpose and control, had been the one giving orders, setting standards, deciding who was worthy of first-class service and who wasn't. And now? Now she was nothing. A disposable employee, a name that would be erased from company records before the sun even rose. The airport moved on without her, and that was the part that truly made her stomach twist. The realization that she wasn't important enough for the world to stop. That her downfall was just another scandal, another fleeting moment in an industry that thrived on replacing people like her without hesitation. She had spent her career believing she held power, only to discover that power had never belonged to her in the first place. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and follow our channel for more jaw-dropping real-life stories that will leave you speechless. A sharp ding from her pocket snapped her out of her thoughts. Her phone. She had forgotten it was even there. With stiff fingers, she pulled it out, the screen glowing with notifications. She almost didn't want to look, didn't want to see the messages, the emails, the inevitable fallout. But she did. And what she saw sent her stomach plummeting further. A company-wide memo had just been sent out. Her name was in it. Subject: immediate termination, employee conduct violation. Her breath caught. She wasn't even at the review meeting yet. They had already made their decision. The email was blunt, cold, merciless. It stated in corporate-approved language that Miss Emily Whitmore had violated company policies regarding passenger conduct, and as such, her employment was terminated effective immediately. There would be no appeals process, no second chance, no discussion. She was, for all intents and purposes, erased. And it wasn't just internal. The media had already caught on. A second notification, a breaking news alert, made her blood run cold. Viral video: Imperial Skies, flight attendant fired, after shocking incident involving CEO's family. Emily's hands tightened around the phone. She clicked the link, and there it was. The video. The same moment she had convinced herself would be forgotten, now immortalized forever in pixelated clarity. She watched, horrified as the footage played out, her own face twisted in irritation, her hand reaching out. That split second where she had smacked a child's tiny wrist. And then the moment where everything had changed. Zayden Grayson's calm, calculated voice. The way the cabin had gone silent. The exact moment she had lost everything. She scrolled down to the comments. She shouldn't just be fired. She should be banned from flying altogether. Unbelievable. Imagine thinking you can get away with this on the CEO's kid. I have zero sympathy. I fly Imperial Skies all the time, and honestly, I hope they do a full investigation into how many other passengers she's mistreated. Deserved. Every second of it. Emily couldn't breathe. This wasn't just losing her job. This was career death. She wasn't coming back from this. No airline would hire her. No one would take the risk. Even low-budget carriers would turn her away once they saw her name in a background check. She had seen it happen before: flight attendants who had been involved in scandals, crew members whose names became liabilities. They were wiped from the industry like they had never existed, and now she was one of them. She swallowed, her throat raw, and forced herself to keep walking. The security guards led her toward a restricted area, and she knew what was coming next. She would surrender her badge, her uniform, her entire identity. The last remnants of Emily Whitmore, first-class enforcer, senior flight attendant of Imperial Skies Airlines, would be stripped away. And when she walked out of that airport tonight, she would be nobody. The doors slid open ahead of her, the cold night air rushing in like a slap. She hesitated, her pulse hammering, her feet reluctant to take the final step. But there was nothing left for her here. Nothing left anywhere. So, with the weight of her shattered career pressing against her chest, Emily walked out into the darkness, knowing she had nowhere left to go. The lesson from this story is clear. Power is never truly yours if it can be taken away in an instant. Emily Whitmore believed she had authority over others, that she controlled who belonged and who didn't. But her power was an illusion, one that shattered the moment she crossed the wrong person. She failed to recognize that true power lies not in controlling others, but in how you treat them. Her downfall wasn't just about slapping a child. It was about her deep-seated arrogance, her pattern of bias, and her belief that she was untouchable. In the end, the very power she wielded over passengers was used against her. The same airline she had worked for erased her without hesitation, and the people she once dismissed watched her fall without sympathy. This story serves as a reminder that respect is not about rank or position. It's about character. Those who build their authority on intimidation and prejudice will eventually find themselves powerless. Because in the real world, one wrong move can turn the enforcer into the exiled.